Hi, it's Amy from Amorini Designs, and today I'm here to show how to make a fabric pumpkin. This is using my pattern fabric pumpkin patch that you can find in my Etsy shop. I will include a link in the description below. This pattern comes with 5 different sizes of pumpkins. This one is the small pumpkin, and it also comes with 2 different leaf options, 2 different stem options, and lots of fun varieties. You can make fall looking pumpkins, or you can make Halloween pumpkins just by switching out your fabrics. They are lots of fun and so addicting. I think you'll find yourself making a whole patch of them. And we're going to get started showing you how to do all of it right now. To begin making our pumpkin, you'll want to start out by cutting out all of your fabric pieces. You will need 6 of the pumpkin panel pieces. You will need 2 stems and 2 leaves. On the leaves and the stems, you will need to have them be mirror images of each other. So I just take my piece of fabric, fold it in half, and then cut out both at the same time. Whether it's right sides together or wrong sides together, it doesn't really matter as long as the 2 pieces are mirror images. On the pumpkin panel pieces, it doesn't really matter. Typically, I will put my fabric into thirds or fourths and cut out anywhere from 2 to 4 pieces at a time until I have all 6 of my pieces cut out. Once I have all of the pieces cut out, then you need to take your pattern piece, and I will use just like a pin, or if you have a really small hole punch, and you'll want to make a hole at each end of your pattern piece so that you can mark those, put those markings onto your fabric pieces. You will want to mark those 2 holes at the top and the bottom of 4 of the 6 of your panel pieces. This is going to indicate where to start and stop your sewing, and so it's really important that you have those marked on at least 4 of those pumpkin panel pieces. Once everything is marked, we're ready to start sewing our pumpkin together. The first thing that you're going to do is take 2 pieces of your pumpkin, and you're going to put them right sides together, and you'll sew starting at the mark at the top and sew down to the mark at the bottom. You want to make sure that you back stitch at the beginning and ending of your stitching all the way through this project, because there's a lot of places where you're going to add some tension to your stitches, and you want to make sure that you have it nice and secure so that you don't have to worry about those seams coming apart. Once you have 2 pieces sewn together, then you will take another set of 2 pieces and sew them together. And then you're going to add your 3rd piece. And this is where it starts to look a little wonky and get a little bit tricky. So you will take your 2 pieces, you're going to open them up, and then you're going to take your 3rd panel piece for this section. So we're going to make 2 halves of our pumpkin, and you will line up the points of these 2 panel pieces so that they're lined up, and then you'll want to line up the edge of that fabric as well to make sure that it's all lined up. Now, there's a couple of things you want to pay attention to. One is making sure that the fabric from this piece is well out of the way, and so it's not going to get caught in your seam allowance. The other thing that you're going to want to do is be careful to make sure that you're not stretching or distorting the edge of your pumpkin. It is cut on a curve, which means there's going to be some stretch and give to it. So you want to do your best to just try to keep things loose and lined up. What I typically like to do is pin right at the top, and then I will just kind of ease them together as I sew. But if it's more comfortable for you to go ahead and pin the whole thing, you can pin it all the way to the bottom. Then you're going to sew on that seam again using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Again, starting and stopping at the points that are marked on your piece. And when you're sewing any of these curves, but especially once you're adding these second pieces and then when you add the 2 halves together, if you have the option on your sewing machine to leave your needle in the down position, do that and start and stop your stitching every few stitches. So you will start here, back stitch, stitch a few, lift up your presser foot with the needle down, pivot your fabric just a little bit, and then continue working your way around. It's a little bit slower, but it will help to avoid any stretching or distorting. taking your time to make sure that you aren't stretching your seams at all on this pumpkin is going to help you end up with a more uniform look to your pumpkin, and you'll be a lot happier with the final result if you do. So once you have sewn on that second side, you will have a piece that looks like this. So it's kind of wonky and funky, and then we're going to take 2 of these and sew them together. So here I have my 2 sections that are all sewn together. I've started and stopped up at the top. And this is where it's going to be really handy to make sure you have some pins and some patience and work hard to keep the extra fabric out of the way. So I will kind of open up this half, and then I'm going to open up the second half. And again, I'm going to start with just one side, and I'm going to line up the point of this piece with the point of this other piece. And I'm just going to start by lining up those 2 points up at the top, and then I'm going to put a pin in place there. And when I'm putting that pin in place, I'm also going to feel the fabric of all of the other panels and make sure that they are pulled out of the way, so that I use this pin not only to hold this point in place, but also to kind of push the rest of that fabric out of the way and make sure it's not going to get caught in my seam allowance. The top and the bottom is where you're going to run into the most opportunity to catch that extra fabric in the seam allowance. Then I'm going to come around, and again, I'm just going to keep pinning. I'm going to come around and kind of gently pin these. Again, I'm trying really hard to keep the fabric kind of loose, so I'm not pulling on it at all until I get to the bottom. Now you have a couple of options here. You can either continue on and pin this second side together, but typically what I like to do is I will just sew this one side all the way around, and then I will pull it off my machine and come back to the second side and sew that one. And you're going to repeat the same process. Again, you want to make sure that you're keeping all the fabric out of that seam allowance. Pin at the point, work your seam around so that they're lined up nicely. The last thing that you want to pay attention to on this final seam that you're sewing together is you want to leave an opening for turning so that you can turn your pumpkin right side out. So if my fabric has a directionality to it, I will be sure to leave the opening for turning towards the bottom of that pumpkin. That way it's just a little bit more hidden in the curvature of the pumpkin. So I would begin sewing at the top here, sew down till about, say here. Make sure that you back stitch at the end of that stitching. Then I would leave an opening 2 or 3 inches, and then again back stitch and continue the rest of that seam to back stitch. It's easier if you don't leave that opening right up to this center here, because you have so many seams coming together. Trying to hand stitch it closed is going to be tricky. So I always try to give myself at least an inch of sewing with my machine towards the center here to make sure that I have that nice and secure. And that way I don't have to try to hand stitch where all of those seams are coming together. Once you have that second side seam sewn, then it's going to look something like this. One half nested inside the other. And then I will open up where I have left this opening for turning. And I'm going to turn my pumpkin right side out. You don't need to clip the corners on these. It's a gentle enough curve that it shouldn't be too much of a problem. But you're going to panic maybe a little when you turn this right side out, because it looks nothing like a pumpkin and it's a little awkward and wonky. But we're going to go stuff it and then come back, and then it will be fantastic. Before we finish with our sewing machine, there's a couple more steps to tackle at the machine. The first is our stem. So we're going to place the 2 pieces right sides together, and then you're going to sew around the 2 sides and the top using your 1/4 inch seam allowance. Again, make sure that you back stitch at the starting and stopping of your stitching. Then you're going to take some scissors and you're going to clip the corners of your stem. And in this case, I only do the top two. I don't worry about the bottom, but on the curved stem, I find it's helpful to go ahead and cut one little notch here on the inside curve. And then I also cut just a couple of notches into the seam allowance of the outside curve. Again, you want to make sure that you are not getting too close to the stitch line, but you do want to get as close as you can without going through it. Kind of a little Price is Right moment there. On your straight stems, you will want to just clip the two corners at the top of the stem. And then you will take your stem piece and you're going to turn it right side out. To do this, typically I will fold over the seam allowance on one side and kind of pinch it between my fingers to keep that seam allowance to one side. And then it is helpful if you have a blunt turning tool, a chopstick, something. I'm just going to go ahead and use my pin here to pull out the corners and give yourself nice sharp corners on your stem. So once you have those all turned out and your corners turned out, the last step to prep our stem for stuffing is to turn the seam on the bottom under a scant 1/4 inch. So again, I'm going to keep my seam allowance pushed to one side, and then I'm just going to use my fingers to kind of pinch it. And it gets a little bit tricky pinching both sides at the same time. But once I have them pinched, then I sort of pull them away from each other to tuck under the rest of the seam allowance. I use my fingers to finger press that as well as I can until I have the whole thing kind of tucked under. Sometimes I'll pinch one side, come back. It takes a minute, so be patient with it. Sometimes it helps if you want to use a couple of dots of like a fabric glue to kind of help keep your seam allowance tucked underneath there. It doesn't have to be perfectly even because we're going to hand stitch this onto our finished pumpkin. But if you keep working at it, eventually you'll get it all the way tucked under and it will look something like that. So you'll see that you could take it to your iron and give it a much more firm crease if you feel more comfortable doing that. I find finger pressing is just enough. You just want to make sure that you have a nice crease at that seam allowance. That's going to help you with your guide as you go to stitch this onto your stuffed pumpkin. Then we're going to take this and set it aside with our pumpkin body. Both of those will need to be stuffed. The final thing to address at our sewing machines, and this is totally optional, if you're adding the leaves, one way that I like to add leaves to my pumpkins is to cut out the two pieces out of fabric. Now you can do a leaf out of felt. There's a lot of options with the leaves. This is just one way that I have found makes it fun and easy to add a little accent fabric to it and add a little bit of drama. I will take my two leaves and put them wrong sides together, and then I will sew around the entire outside of my leaf using a scant 1/8 of an inch. So just right up next to the edge all the way around. And then I will use my sewing machine to just stitch in some veins into my leaf just to give it a little bit more interest and body. You can do this with a contrasting thread or a coordinating thread. Another option with this, if you don't want to do the 2 layers, is you could use a fabric stiffening spray to stiffen up your leaf. You could add some curl to it or shape using starch, or you can go ahead and just leave it 1 layer of fabric. Or again, if you're using felt, you can hand stitch some details, some veining, or whatever you want. There's lots of different ways to finish the leaf. But if you're going to finish it this way, you'll want to take care of that at your sewing machine, and then you're going to set this aside, and then we're going to get to stuffing our pumpkins. I have a couple of tips for you when it comes to stuffing your pumpkin. The first is it's going to take a lot more stuffing than you think. For me personally, I really like my pumpkins nice and firm. It helps accentuate the different ridges on the pumpkin, and it just gives it a much nicer shape and feel to me. You obviously are making your own pumpkin. You can stuff it as much as you want. The second tip that I have is, instead of just pulling a handful straight out of the bag, take a little piece of your stuffing first and then separate any big lumps or sections that you find. This is going to help have an overall smoother look to your pumpkin and help to eliminate so many bumps and lumps in your pumpkin. So the next thing that I will do is I will take my stuffing and I'll find a spot. So like this ridge here is a little bit flat. So I'm going to take my stuffing and just use my fingers and push it down into that spot to make sure that it has a nice full ridge. And I'm going to make sure I do that with all of the ridges on both the bottom and the top. So I will just keep adding stuffing to it. I will keep turning it around and making sure that I am stuffing my pumpkin as even as I can, and making sure that there's not any low spots. The other thing that that will help with is when you come to tuft your pumpkin, it is much easier to do it if you have a pumpkin that's stuffed all the way around. You don't get as many puckers in your fabric and stuff when you go to that next step. So to set that aside, I have a couple other tips for stuffing your stems. Now, the stems, especially the curved stems, especially the small stems, are really tiny and difficult to get the stuffing in there. It's something you definitely can do just by hand. I will just take a little piece and stuff it up, and sometimes I will just use my pinky to get it up there. A chopstick is very helpful for this. But there is a stuffing tool that you can find. This one is from, I want to say it's a Sizzix one. And I don't know if you'll be able to see, if I can show you up here, but the top has a little cross cut into it. And that is so helpful for grabbing the stuffing and pushing it down up into the corners of your stem. So I will take my little piece of stuffing and then I will use my tool, and that little forked end will just grab the stuffing and shove it in. Again, this is called a stuffing tool. It's a really handy tool if you're doing things like dolls, anything that has kind of a skinny section that needs to be stuffed. I find this tool super helpful. So I will use that to, again, I want to fill all of my corners and get it all the way stuffed. The other thing that you want to make sure is that you are stuffing it right up to the edge, and making sure that it's full all the way to the bottom so that when you go to stitch your stem on top of your pumpkin, it's full and solid all the way down to the bottom. So we have those stuffed. I'm going to go finish stuffing this, then we'll come back and I'll show you how to close up this opening. Okay, I have my pumpkin nice and firmly stuffed, and now it's time to do a ladder stitch to close this opening. Now, if you don't mind seeing that seam a little bit, you could totally do like a whip stitch and just pull them together. But a ladder stitch is almost invisible when it comes to this seam, and I just find it's a lot better stitch. It's the one I prefer. Okay, so you will see that you have your seam allowances for both of these sides kind of folded under, and I try to make sure, see if I can show you that there. Okay, that there's that seam allowance folded under on both sides. And sometimes I will even take my fingers and kind of crease it a little bit to give me somewhere to aim for when I'm putting my ladder stitches through. Then I've left my opening towards the bottom of my pumpkin. So this is going to be the bottom. This is going to be the top. So I'm going to start my stitching here so that my knot ends up at the bottom and it's really almost impossible to see on the finished pumpkin. I'm going to use a short needle, and I want to use just a skinny, and it just can just be a regular sewing needle. It doesn't need a very big eye. You're only using a single strand of thread to do this. I've tied a knot in one end of my thread, and now I'm going to go ahead and put that knot into my pumpkin. So what I like to do is I will take my needle and I will bring it up through the seam allowance. See if I can show you that up close, so that the knot will end up in that seam allowance. So I'm going to pull this needle through, and there's my knot. It goes and it's underneath that fold. Okay, so once it's in there, the next thing I'm going to do is I am going to kind of push that stuffing a little bit away, and I'm going to fold my 2 seam allowances into each other. So I'm going to hold them close like this. All right, now we're going to get going on our ladder stitch and get a better grip on that. Okay, to do the ladder stitch, you are going to go through one side of that seam allowance. See if I can show you where it's caught on my needle. I'm going to pull that through and I'm going to leave that stitch a little bit loose. Then I'm going to come into the seam allowance directly opposite of where that stitch came out. So I'm going to come in through this seam allowance right here, and I'm going to pull out my needle through a little bit of that fabric, about the same length of my stitch, and I'm going to pull that. So now you can see that stitch coming across the opening, and I'm just going to continue working my way down. So I'm going to do a couple more stitches. Again, I'm going through the crease of that seam allowance. So even though my seam allowance fabric is pulling a little bit funny, what I'm trying to do is keep my needle on that seam allowance that I kind of have finger creased a little bit. Pull that through. So now you can see that the stitches are starting to look a little bit like a ladder as they go across that opening. I'm going to just stick a couple more quick stitches in here through my seam allowance. And then this is where the magic happens. So you can see those stitches there, and then I'm going to pull it, and then that seam starts to disappear. So I will continue doing my ladder stitch down. I'll just do a couple more to show you. And it's easier to do it when you bring the seam allowances closer to each other to make sure that you're lining up those stitches directly across from each other. That's what's going to help this seam stay straight. But again, we're working with curves here. It's a little bit wonky, and I'm trying to show you one-handed. So if it's a little bit distorted, it's going to be just fine. These are handmade after all. All right, so I'm going to get one more stitch through there, see my ladder, and then I'm going to zip it closed. And then you can see that that seam allowance is disappearing. I'm going to finish sewing this up, and then I'm going to come back and show you the next couple of steps with our pumpkin. Okay, I have my seam all the way closed, and I have my thread coming out here at the bottom. I'm going to show you really quick how I go ahead and tie a knot in this. If you have a different method that you prefer, you are absolutely welcome to do whatever feels good to you. All right, I'm just going to take my needle, and I'm going to go through both sides of that seam and just a couple of threads on my needle. And then I'm going to, that makes a loop through my thread, and I'm going to bring my needle through that loop, and it's going to create a knot. And then I'm just going to repeat that one more time, bring it through, make the loop, pull my needle through the loop, and tighten that knot. And then the last thing I'm going to do is bury some of this thread inside the pumpkin to help that knot stay in place. So I'm just going to put my needle into the pumpkin right next to that knot, and then I'm going to push it through a couple of inches away. Again, it's a short needle, so you can only go as far as your needle is long. And then I'm going to go ahead and bury that thread. So I'm going to give it just a little bit of a pull so that then the tip of that thread gets pulled back inside the pumpkin. Now you might notice when you do that, that you have a little bit of a flat spot. So you can see this one's nice and round, and it's a little bit flat where I've sewn that. So sometimes what I'll do is I will just take my pumpkin and I'll give it a little bit of a massage to kind of even out. The other thing that I like to do is kind of make sure that where all of those pieces of the wedges come together, that's kind of in the middle of my pumpkin. Sometimes you have to shift things around a little bit. And then you have your nice even-ish, because it is handmade, pumpkin. All right, now we're ready to do the next step, which is one of my favorite steps, and it is tufting the pumpkin. So the first thing that you're going to do is get some thread or yarn. I like to use like a thin weight yarn. You could use twine, whatever you want to do. And we are going to measure off how much we need. So what I do is I leave a little bit of a tail, and then I will go around my pumpkin about 4 times. 3, that's 4, and then I'll go again another half or so, and that's how I measure how much yarn I need for my pumpkin. So I'm gonna pull that off, and then if you find yourself making a bunch of pumpkins, even if you only make a couple, do yourself a favor and get an upholstery needle. This is a tufting needle. It comes, this particular one came in a set of, I believe, 4 or 5 needles from Hobby Lobby. It was like $6 for the whole set. There's a few different lengths. I think this is the second to the shortest one. Maybe it's a little longer than that. But it has a great big eye, perfect for your thread. It actually has a couple of grooves in the end of that needle so that the yarn sits more cleanly inside there, and it's going to let you get all the way through your pumpkin with no trouble at all. All right, so we are going to tie a knot in the end of our yarn here. And if you have a very long tail there, you may want to go ahead and just trim that down. And then the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to bury the tip of our yarn into our pumpkin. So I will find where my seam is, knowing this is the bottom, and I am going to go down through the top. Now this is going to do 2 things. One, your knot, if it's visible at all, will be hidden by the stem. But the other reason I like to start from the top and come out the bottom is that when you push this needle through and the yarn comes out, it does grab a little bit of that stuffing inside of here and pulls it a little bit. So in order to keep the top of our pumpkin as clean as possible, I bring the needle out through the bottom, in through the top. That way there's not as much stuffing at the top. And we will, of course, go back and trim as much stuffing as we can, but this just gives your top a much cleaner look. So I've gone through a little bit of the fabric. I try to give it something to grip onto in the top. And then I just choose one wedge of the pumpkin to come out of, and I will come out about a 1/2 inch or so away from the center of this pumpkin. And the reason I do that is we're going to put a little bit of tension on this yarn to tuft our pumpkin. And I don't want to add more tension onto these stitches that are already kind of holding this pumpkin together. I want it to get some grip through the fabric here to just give it a little bit more stability as we go and create the extra ridges in our pumpkin. All right, so I'm going to pull that yarn through, and then you're going to see that needle, or that, obviously I did not make a big enough knot, and I also did not catch fabric like I thought I did. All right, here we go. Try this again, take 2. Okay, so I'm through there, and then I'm going to come out the bottom over to one side. I'm going to try to hit that hole again. All right, I'm going to pull this through. My knot is going to catch. I'm going to make a new knot just for funsies. All right, we're just going to leave that knot as the knot. I'm going to pull it, and then I'm going to trim the extra thread there. Okay, so I have that knot here. I've come out the bottom. Then I'm going to bring my yarn around following the same wedge that it came out the bottom. And then I'm going to go in through the top. And this one, I'm going to be a little closer to the middle than I am on the bottom, but I am still making sure to not go all the way through the center of it. So in this case, I'm a generous 1/4 of an inch, not quite 1/2 inch on this side. So then I'm going to put it through there. And then when I bring it out the bottom, I'm going to bring it out opposite the side it just went through. So in this case, it's going to come out here. So then I'm going to pull my yarn. And now I have it just very loose on there, but I want to give it a little extra ridge. So I'm going to pull on my yarn, and you can see how it creates that tufted look to it. So you can pull it as tight as you want, but you can see that the tighter you pull, your fabric begins to pucker. So I like to pull it so that there's a nice ridge, but not too much puckering. You might get a little bit depending on how firmly you've stuffed your pumpkin. And if there's just a couple, then you can run your finger along that and kind of smooth out those puckers. But then once you've decided and it's the tension that you like, you're going to keep that tension on your yarn. And I will do this with the hand that is kind of holding the pumpkin. And then you're going to, again, come in at the top. And again, it's a little bit closer than it was on the bottom. And then you're going to come through, and I'm going to choose one side of this. It doesn't matter which order you go in, but that's opposite, but to one side. And then you're going to pull your yarn again. And then again, you're going to add a little tension to it. Keep your tension on the yarn. And then we're just going to keep working our way around. In this case, I'm going directly opposite because that one's not done. We're going to pull, give it the tension, and then finish our last side. So then I'll just come through on this side that's not done. Now on the bottom, I try to keep them all approximately the same distance from the center. Sometimes I'm closer, sometimes I'm not. And then if you have found that you let go of the tension that was in there, oh, I've got a little knot going on this side. So if you have found that you have let go, because like I had to untangle that knot and stuff here, so I will pull on this, and then if I find that this is the one that I did just before that and it's a little looser than I want, then I will pull on this and just keep pulling around until I get all the tension that I want on all of my sections, if that makes sense. All right, so then I'm going to come around again through the top, out the bottom on the opposite side. See if I can show you that there. And then around through this last one. So on this last one, I'm just going to pull it up. This time I am going to get close to that center because I want to be able to kind of hide it. And again, I am going to try to go through more fabric on the opposite side. And I am going to come out the top this time close to the center. Again, I'm trying to catch a little bit of fabric here. Okay, so now I have my tufted pumpkin and I have my yarn coming out the top. So now we need to tie off a knot. So I'm going to do very similar to what I did before. I'm just going to go through this seam. I'm going to make that loop, run my needle through that loop to make the knot. I'm going to make a second one right through those same holes to make that knot. And then I'm just going to take my needle through the center, out the bottom, and then I'm going to give it just a little bit of a pull so that when I snip it, that end disappears down into my pumpkin. So then you have a really pretty clean bottom to your pumpkin, and it's actually a pretty clean top as well. And what little knots and ends that you can see there are going to be covered by our stem. So I'm just going to go and smooth this if there's any smushing that needs to be done. And then the last step is to add our leaf and our stem. So I have my leaf here. I went ahead and added the veining to it, just again, using my sewing machine. And again, you want to make sure that you're paying attention to where your hand sewn seam is, so that that's the bottom. So you make sure you're adding things to the top. And then when I do that, I like to kind of decide, do I want the ridge with the vein you know, with the yarn to be the front? Do I kind of want this to be the front? And that is what I will use to kind of gauge where I'm going to place my stem as well as my leaf. Do I want my leaf hanging off to one side? Do I want it hanging off to the other side? Do I want it to droop a little bit more? Do I want it to be tucked up closer? So those are all things that you can play with your stem here and your leaf, and decide what you want to do. So I am going to have my leaf be a little bit higher so that when I stick my stem on there, it's kind of tucked up in there, and that is going to be so cute. So once I kind of decide where I want my leaf to land, I'm going to take my needle and thread, the same that I was using to sew up that side seam. I'm going to tie a knot in it, and then I'm just going to add a couple of stitches here through the stem and through the pumpkin, the stem of my leaf and the pumpkin here, to keep it in place. And you might have to squish down on your pumpkin a little bit to get it through the fabric. You might catch your edges of your leaves. It's going to be all kinds of exciting and fun. All right, so I'm just going to add a few stitches here. Again, I want to make sure I'm getting through the pumpkin fabric to make sure that things are nice and secure. Now I'm going to go ahead and leave my thread here. Now, if you haven't added a leaf and you just have a loose knot at the end of your thread, you will go ahead and take your thread and run it through the seam allowance here on the inside of your stem. Let's see if I can get my needle to slide under that seam allowance there. So you can see right here, I've got it through that seam allowance, just like we did when we closed up the seam on the side. And have your needle come out through that seam allowance, and then you'll just bury your knot inside the stem. In this case, it's going to be buried just underneath the stem on the leaf. So I have my thread coming through the stem there, and then I'm going to go ahead and just position my stem where I want it to be, what I want to be front facing, kind of center it on my pumpkin here. And then I'm going to try to lower my camera here and give you a better view, because this is a two-handed endeavor. Okay, we have our leaf, our stem, our needle and thread. I have the thread coming out from the bottom of my stem through that seam allowance. And now what I'm going to do is do a ladder stitch, but instead of going through two sides of a seam, I'm going to go through the stem and through the pumpkin. So I'm going to put my needle through about where that thread is coming out of the stem, and I'm going to catch a little bit of leaf. All right, I'm going to catch a little bit of fabric, and then you can see that stitch right there. Then I'm going to keep working my way around, getting a little bit of stem through that seam allowance and a little bit of pumpkin coming out the same direction. So typically on one needle, I will have stem and pumpkin, and then I will pull through that one stitch so that it has both the stem and the pumpkin. And I will leave those stitches a little bit loose until I have about 5 or 6 stitches, because it's easier to get my needle through the seam allowance and through the pumpkin if I have a little bit more play to it. But we don't want to get too far around before we tighten them, because we want our stem nice and secure. So again, I'm pulling that through. I have it on my stem and my pumpkin. I'm going to pull that down. And then if you find that your stuffing is sticking out a little bit, you might just want to tuck that in. So now I'm going to give it a nice tug so that those stitches come close. And then I'm going to keep working my way all the way around the stem. And I typically go around at least 2 times. But when you get to where you're almost at the start of your stitching, If you find that you need a little bit more stuffing under there, make sure that you get a little bit tucked underneath there before you get all the way to the end. So I'm just going to keep stitching around so that you can kind of see the process and how that looks. And you can see that I have the end of my leaf sticking out here. I have a couple of options. I can either tuck it underneath the stem. So I'm just going to use my needle and help kind of push it underneath there. Or you can just trim off the extra bit of stem from your leaf. So I have that tucked underneath there. And then I'm going to go ahead and go around one more time. You can see that there's places that there's a little bit of gapping. And so what I'm going to try to do is place my stitches to close those little holes to make sure that it's nice and evenly stitched all the way around. And then I'll also give just a little bit of a tug to it and make sure that it feels nice and solid on my pumpkin. And then again, when I come over to attach the stem around where the leaf is, I'm going to try to position my stitches so that I'm catching that leaf fabric as well, just giving it a couple of more stitches to help secure it in place. Okay, I'm pretty happy with how I have my stem on there and the leaf. Now I wanted to add and just show you one other option you can do with your leaf. So I kind of like how this is just hanging down like that, but if you wanted to add a little bit more dimension, maybe have it stand up a little bit, then one thing that you can do is bring your thread from your stem, and I'm just going to push it through my pumpkin a little bit to bring it out where I need it. So I'm going to come out kind of where that leaf is, the base of that leaf is. And then I'm going to fold it right where I have that vein. And I'm going to just put a couple of stitches right through that vein, kind of catching the pumpkin, to just put the tiniest of little creases into that leaf. And then that leaf is going to kind of stand up on its own, and then you can kind of give it a little bit more shape as you like, but then it's going to have a little bit of lift to the back side of that leaf and give you just a little bit more height to it if you wanted to put this, say, on a shelf or on a tiered tray and you want that leaf to stand out a little bit more. So then again, we're going to just finish off our stem and leaf the same way. So I'm just going to hide my knot here underneath the leaf. If you're doing it over by the stem, you'll want to get as close to the stem as you can. But again, we're just going to catch a little bit of fabric, make our loop, tie our knot, repeat to do a second knot, and then we are going to bury our thread by taking our needle right through next to that knot, squish it together to get it to come out of that pumpkin, Then give it a little bit of a pull as you're cutting it so that that end just disappears right into the pumpkin. Now, like I said, you may find that there's a little bit of stuffing fibers hanging out from the bottom of your stem. You may want to take a nice sharp pair of scissors and go around and trim any of those off that you see. But we have our pumpkin here and it's all finished.